All right, well, we're going to continue where we left off last week. I just want to remind us at the introduction that we all make choices every day. This is how we started off. And all decisions have consequences. They don't all carry the same weight, but they all have consequences. And sometimes the consequences are much more far-reaching than we realize. And then, of course, sometimes it's too late to fix things. And even though God forgives, like he did with David, he did forgive him, but the consequences of his actions continued on because that's the law of sowing and reaping is in place there. All right, so on your outline, if you have it here, we got down through J, and so we're going to pick it up with K. And for that, we're going to need to turn to 1 Kings chapter 13. All right, 1 Kings chapter 13. And in 1 Kings chapter 13, we have the account of the Lord Jehovah sending a prophet from down south in Judah up to Samaria to pronounce judgment against Jeroboam and the altar that was there in Bethel, which he does. He does exactly what God told him to do. He pronounces the judgment against it. God shows a sign, first of all, by making the king's hand freeze up so that he can't move it. And then secondly, he pronounces that the altar would be rent and the ashes torn out, and miraculously that happens right there in front of everyone. And then when King Jeroboam asks him to pray to God that his hand would be restored, he does, and his hand is restored. At which point, the king wants to give him a reward and send him on his way. And at this time, we find out that God had specifically told him that he was not to stay there, he was not to eat anything there, he was not to drink anything there, he was not to receive any kind of reward, and he wasn't even supposed to go home the same way that he came. And so he had very specific instructions from God on not only what to do, but how to go about doing it, getting there, and everything else. So the prophecy and everything about the prophecy had been given to him by the word of the Lord, it says, ahead of time. The problem was he did everything right, and he left, went another way. But on his way out, he decided to sit under a tree and rest for a little while. And in the meantime, there was another old prophet there. Another old prophet who also had to make a decision. Now, this old prophet heard about this other prophet, and he thought, boy, I haven't seen another good prophet around here in a long time. Apparently, God hadn't been using this man for a long time. And so selfishly, he gets up and he chases down the man, and he invites him home for dinner and to refresh himself so that they could talk together as two prophets. And remember, this was an older prophet, someone that the younger prophet would have had some kind of respect for, knowing his position. So when he invited the man specifically told him that by the word of the Lord, God had told him not to eat or drink anything here, not even to go home the same way. But the old man chose to lie to him. And he told him that an angel of God had appeared to him and told him to bring him back home and take care of him. And this young man, instead of believing what God had told him to do, believed the old prophet. And as a result, he went back, and that old prophet finally got to prophesy again. But he had to prophesy a message of judgment against the younger prophet. And then, that younger prophet, when he left, It specifically said he went back. I don't know if he went back the way he was leaving or if he actually started to go back the same way he had come. But whatever it is, while he was leaving, God sent a lion, and that lion tore him. The donkey that he had been riding was untouched. But that prophet was now dead. Because he disobeyed the word of the Lord and believed someone else who was telling him something that was contrary to what God had told him originally, God pronounced that he would die. He wouldn't go home to his family, and that he would die, basically. But there were consequences for the old prophet too, by the way. The old prophet had to pronounce that judgment against him, live with the fact that he was the cause of his death for the rest of his life. So there were consequences for both of these men. One for lying, and one for believing something that was contrary to what God had told him originally. And think about this also. That young man's family never got to see him again. They never probably knew what happened to him up there in Samaria. So it didn't just affect him and the old prophet. It affected that young man's family as well. All right, then let's turn over to 1 Kings chapter 22. Verse 2, and it came to pass in the 3rd year that Jehoshaphat the king of Judah came down to the king of Israel, and the king of Israel said unto his servants, Know ye that Ramoth Gilead is ours, and we be still, and take it not out of the hand of the king of Syria. And he said unto Jehoshaphat, Wilt thou go with me to battle to Ramoth Gilead? And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as thou art, my people as thy people, my horses as thy horses. And Jehoshaphat said unto the king of Israel, Inquire, I pray thee, at the word of the Lord today. And as you know, a bunch of prophets came out, and they told him to go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper. And then Jehoshaphat said, Is there not a prophet of the Lord, of Jehovah, beside all these other prophets here, that we can inquire by him? So we've inquired by your gods. Now I want to inquire by my God. Now, what was the problem with Jehoshaphat? First of all, he made affinity with somebody who was God's enemy. He chose to join. Now, what was his reasoning? Oh, well, they're all the children of Israel too, maybe. It's good for us politically not to have this war between our kingdom and the northern kingdom. After all, we be brethren, whatever it may be. He probably had a lot of good human reasoning going on why this would be a good thing. But like we talked about Joshua, he probably didn't inquire of the Lord about this, because I don't see how God would have told him to join affinity with somebody who had set up Baal worship and it was leading the people of the northern kingdom astray so that they were not following Jehovah anymore at all. You know, the one thing about Jeroboam, when he made his decision to set up those golden calves, was he called it Jehovah worship. They were just doing it in the way that the heathen did it. But they were still supposedly worshiping the God of Israel. Not only did Ahab follow that line of reasoning, which was wrong, we all know that, but now he, through marrying a heathen woman, introduced complete heathenism into Israel. Baal worship was wicked. Baal worship involved all sorts of awful things that they did as part of the worship, and as a result, this man was totally against God, had the judgment of God upon him. God had already told him that God had rejected him and that he was going to remove him and his line from being kings, and God was going to replace him with someone else, and his whole family line was going to be extinguished from Israel. Not only did Jehoshaphat join affinity with Ahab, he also, the second thing he did wrong, was he made a decision to go to battle with him without inquiring of the Lord first. Notice that when he told him, my horses are as thy horses, my people as thy people, then he said, let's inquire of the Lord. That was backwards. Okay? So he already committed himself before he inquired of the Lord. And then when he heard the different prophecies, he still stood to the word that he said, that he would go up to battle with them. But then there is a third, well, I'll get to that in a minute. The results of this union and going into battle with him was Jehoshaphat, except by the grace of God, was almost killed in that battle. If it wasn't for God putting it into the heart of the king of Assyria to say, fight with no man, great or small, except with the king of Israel, Jehoshaphat would have died in that battle. The whole army thought he was the king of Israel, and they went after him. But then somebody realized that this wasn't the king of Israel. This was a different king, and our orders were to only fight with the king of Israel, and so they left him alone. That was the grace of God. Even though he was completely wrong, he had a lot of things right, Jehoshaphat. He was one of the better kings. But in this area, he was completely wrong, but God had grace upon him and allowed for him not to be killed in that battle and be able to go back home. Another thing that happens, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 11, and this is all part of this same story. Now the next king was Ahaziah. Or excuse me, the next, a couple of kings down. So what had happened was Jehoshaphat allowed his son to marry Athaliah. Athaliah was a heathen woman. Athaliah ended up, when her son died, destroying all the seed royal except for one that God saved, which was Joash, took over the kingdom for 6 years, destroyed the temple, turned the hearts of the people even further away from God, ruled over a nation that she had no business ruling over because she was not one of the sons of David. And only by the grace of God, allowing the high priest to save one of those children, to protect him inside the temple area where Athaliah couldn't get at him, and then eventually proclaim him to be king. And the people, of course, they wanted their real king. They didn't want this phony, and they were able to finally get rid of her. But all that was part of Jehoshaphat's decision to join affinity with Ahab. By the way, it was very, very common back then, as we know from Solomon marrying all the wives that he did, that when you made affinity with another king, you would take often a daughter of that king to be your wife, or in his case, to be his son's wife, so that it would cement the union that they were making, because now you were family as well as just confederates. We know also that Athaliah must have had other sons, because she did destroy all the seed royal, but it also talks about her sons. So apparently she had sons previously to marrying Ahaziah, or not Ahaziah, Ahaziah's father. And anyway, the point is, Jehoshaphat made a bad decision, and the effects were really far-reaching. It went down through his son, through his grandson, and it affected the entire kingdom of Judah as a result. And he had no way of seeing that from where he was. And by the way, Jehoshaphat still didn't get it right, because when Ahaziah finally died, or became king, up in the north, before Jehu became king, he made affinity again with Ahab's son in a boat deal, which God broke the boats and stopped it, and then he said, no, we can't have this anymore. So God, he still wasn't right in that sense. We need to learn the lessons when we're wrong. When we do something wrong, we need to learn the lesson because if we continue on, it's just going to cause more problems. And then let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 38. We have two more people who made some wrong choices, and then we'll begin looking at some of the people who actually made good choices and see the results or the consequences of those choices. So in Jeremiah 38, we have King Zedekiah. And in verse 14, it says, Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him into the third entry that is in the house of the Lord. And the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask thee a thing, hide it not from me. Then Jeremiah said unto Zedekiah, If I declare it unto thee, wilt thou not surely put me to death? And if I give thee counsel, wilt thou not hearken unto me? So Zedekiah the king sware secretly unto Jeremiah, saying, As the Lord liveth, that made us this soul, I will not put thee to death, neither will I give thee into the hand of these men that seek thy life. So Jeremiah was very cautious about this meeting. It was a private meeting. He went into this private room, just he and Jeremiah alone, and they made this agreement that he was going to give him the counsel of God, but Zedekiah agreed that he would not put him to death or give him into the hands of other people who were seeking his life as well. Verse 17, Then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, Thus saith the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, If thou wilt shortly go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live and thine house. But if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylon's princes, then shall this city be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. So he got his counsel. And Zedekiah the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand, and they mock me. But Jeremiah said, They shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord, which I speak unto thee. So it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. But if thou refuse to go forth, this is the word that the Lord hath showed me. Behold, all the women that are left in the king of Judah's house shall be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes. And those women shall say, Thy friends have set thee on, and have prevailed against thee. Thy feet are sunk in the mire, and they are turned away back. So shall they bring out all thy wives and thy children unto the Chaldeans, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand, but shalt be taken by the hand of the king of Babylon, and thou shalt cause this city to be burned with fire. Then said Zedekiah unto Jeremiah, Let no man know of these words, and thou shalt not die. So now Zedekiah changed their agreement. He said, Don't tell anybody what was spoken here, and then you won't die. But anyway, Jeremiah didn't tell anybody. He didn't need to. And so, what happened? He was so afraid of what other people thought that he wouldn't do what God said him to do. He was worried about the people that had already been captured that were out there and had been dispersed among the Babylonians. And he says, well, if they deliver me into their hands, they're going to just mock me. They're going to make fun of me, saying, you were a lousy king. You couldn't, keep Jerusalem. Look what you did. By the way, remember Jeconiah, the previous king? What did he do when the king of Babylon came? He surrendered. He was taken captive. He went into Babylon. He was in jail, and eventually he was let out of jail, and he was given a place of honor among all the conquered kings of Babylon. But God specifically told him, and out of fear of what other people might do, out of fear of what other people would think of him, and out of probably pressure from the princes that were there who did not want him to give up and give in to the king of Babylon, he chose to disobey Jeremiah's warning because he feared these men. And as a result, the consequences were, first of all, the city was destroyed and burned with fire. Secondly, the last thing he ever saw was his sons being slain in front of his eyes. And then the king of Babylon had his eyes put out, so that was the last thing he would ever see. And then, of course, he was carried away in captivity and shame to Babylon, where he died a miserable death. Then let's turn to Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 5, we have the account of a married couple by the name of Ananias and Sapphira. Now, if you know what's happening, in the previous chapter, at the end, we're introduced to a man by the name Barnabas. And he, among other people, had decided that they had certain properties that they were going to sell and then give all the money to the apostles to be used for the good of the church. And people looked up to these people now. Barnabas, his name was changed from Joseph to Barnabas, which means son of consolation. And they sold it. They laid the money at the apostles' feet. Unconditionally, they said, the money is yours, and we want nothing back from it. So in chapter 5, it says, but a certain man named Ananias with Sapphira, his wife, sold a possession. No problem there. And kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost, and to keep back part of the price of the land? Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. And Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost. And great fear came on all them that heard these things. And he was buried. And later on, his wife comes in, not knowing what had happened yet. Peter questions her about what had happened, and she propagated the lie still. And then, of course, she died as well. Now, notice Peter tells him in verse 4, whiles it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. Was it wrong for them to only give a part of the price? No. It was under his power. He could have gone in there and said, we sold this piece of property, and we want to give some of the money to the church, but we can't afford to give it all to the church, but we want to give something to the church as a result. And you know what? That would have been fine. The problem was they wanted everyone to think they gave it all. They were being hypocrites. They were saying one thing and doing something else. And of course, God hates hypocrisy. They wanted the prestige, if we can call it that Barnabas and some of these other people who had given all seemed to be getting, which wasn't really prestige. It was just people respected them for what they did. But they wanted that kind of, they wanted to be thought of highly. And quite frankly, I think if they had just done the right thing and given part of that money and kept back part and were honest about it, I think the people would have given them that same respect. Well, the consequences, as we read, was they both died. Why? Because God needed to use them as an example that he hates hypocrisy and he doesn't want it in his church. And so that was what happened with Ananias and Sapphira. Well, this has been sort of a negative portion of this message. But it's important for us to heed these warnings, because whether we look at all the people we talked about and the different reasons why they made these wrong choices, listening to the wrong people, like Adam and Eve, like Eve did, and like the prophet from Judah did, whether it was self-aggrandizement like Nimrod, whether it was not willing to repent because he wanted to worship his own way instead of God's way like Cain, whether it was choosing business over God like Lot, whether it was just not believing God and not doing what he said out of unbelief and fear, like the children of Israel at Kadesh Barnea, whether it was like Joshua not seeking God before he made a decision and being deceived into making a wrong decision, whether it was Samson, who was just gratifying his flesh, whether it was Korah or Saul or Uzziah, who decided that they wanted a job that God hadn't given them to do, enter into the priesthood, or whether it was somebody who was lying for hypocrisy, were hypocrites and lying for prestige's sake. Whatever it was, they made decisions based on the wrong information, on what they wanted to do instead of what God wanted them to do, and the results, the consequences were bad. But now I want to go back and look at some people who made right choices. And this will probably take us this week and next week to finish up, I'm assuming. Let's go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 6 now. And we're going to start with a man by the name of Noah. But before we get to Noah, I just want to mention the counterpart of the first one we talked about, which was Cain, and that is Abel. Abel made the right decision. Abel chose to worship God and bring a sacrifice, the sacrifice that God had said to, and the results were God accepted his sacrifice. And even though his brother ended up killing him, he was right with God. And it says, talks about the voice of, in the New Testament, it talks about the voice of the blood of Abel speaking out of the ground. I don't believe that's talking about his blood screaming for vengeance. It's talking about the blood that he shed in the sacrifice, speaking that he was obedient to God. He believed God, and he brought the right sacrifice. And we have the testimony of Abel to this day as an example to us about we need to worship God in the way that God ordains and not our own way, which a lot of churches are not taking heed to these days. And we need to be careful that doesn't happen to us. Now in Genesis chapter 6 through 10, we read of Noah. It talks about the wickedness that was going on the earth. But it says in verse 8, after God said he was going to destroy the world, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Then it goes on to say this, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. No matter what anybody else was doing, Noah chose to do right, to be right, and to walk with God no matter where God would send him. That's a choice we all have to make. Some of us, in our minds, say we're walking with God. But if we compare what we're doing to the Scriptures, sometimes it doesn't add up. And so we need to be careful about that. But Noah was diligent to make sure that he was walking with God with the light that he had, because he didn't have all the light we have today. And so when God came down and talked to him, and remember this, when God first talked to Noah, it was before any of his sons were born. Okay? His sons were not born for another 20 years, I believe it was, before his first son was born. Now, he is told what is going to happen. Now think of the faith of Noah. It had never rained before, ever. We're told that in the pre-flood world, a mist came up out of the ground and watered everything. That's how God was watering things back then. We didn't have the times and the seasons. There was some sort of a water vapor canopy around the earth that protected it from the harmful rays of the sun, only let a certain light in, which is why all these people and animals lived these huge, long lives, partly. And now God says, it's going to rain. So I'm going to send water from heaven, and it's going to flood the entire world, and I want you to build a boat and rescue all the animals, a portion of all the animals, and your family, and anybody else will get in. And Noah just did what he was told. Why? Because he was walking with God for all those years before, for the, 500 years before then. So this was nothing to believe what God had to say in this. It's very different, something I've never heard about before, but you're God, and if you say this is what's going to happen, I believe it. And so what did he do? He began building the ark. And then when his sons began to be born and got old enough, they began to help him, and he told them about what God had said and why they were building this ark. And those 3 sons eventually grew up and helped him build that ark, and during that time they were able to find 3 young ladies who they were able to convince that this was true and they needed to come with them, and they married the 3 sons of Noah. It also says in the New Testament that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So while he was building the ark, he was warning people about what was going on, what was going to come. And they didn't believe him, except for those 3 girls. And yet he continued to do what God wanted him to do. And what were the consequences? He saved himself. He saved his family. He kept the line of mankind from being extinguished and all the animals from being extinguished in the flood. And of course, God had already promised a line that would lead to a redeemer. And through Noah and through Shem and Arphaxad and down the line, these were the people who were going to bring in the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who would be the Redeemer of all mankind. All this because Noah walked with God, believed God, and he did what God told him to do, unquestioningly. I'm not going to turn. In Genesis also, we read of Joseph. Later on in the book of, what do we know about Joseph? He chose to do right no matter what was going on around him. When his father's testimony was being soiled by some of the behavior of some of his brothers, he let his father know about it. When his brothers decided they wanted to kill him, and he knew his brothers had a grudge against him, but when his father told him, I want you to go check up on your brothers, he went unquestioningly. He didn't say anything about, these guys really don't like me, and he didn't question it. He just did what his father told him to do. When he was sold into Egypt, he never held it against his brothers. And we find that out much later in the story when they realized that, Joe, he's going to hate us now that Dad's dead, and he's going to execute. What did he say? He said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to save much people alive, as it is this day. He said, no matter what you did, God meant that for good in some way. And so I can't hold that against you. You're still my brothers. I still love you. It doesn't matter what you did to me. And I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to cherish you, and I'm going to make sure you stay in that land of Goshen and that you people are safe as long as I'm alive. And he did. He chose, even though he was wrongly made a slave by his brothers, that when he was a slave, to do the best possible job that he could, and to do it to the glory of God. And as a result, God blessed him. He was promoted to a position of leadership in the household. He was made the chief steward of the house of Potiphar as a result. And then, when Potiphar's wife wanted him. He refused. He says, my master has entrusted everything in this house to me, and I'm in control of everything, and I can use everything as I see fit, except you, because you're his wife. But then he said this, how could I do this great evil and sin against God? He recognized that fornication or adultery was a sin against God, and he was not going to have any part of it. And as far as we know, he did not try to defend himself when she lied about him. He just simply took the judgment that came, and again, he was wrongly put into prison. And what did he do there? He continued to serve in that prison in a way that glorified God. God blessed the prison house because of him. He was able, because of his position, to speak to the baker and the butler, tell them about the dream that they had. And then as a result, when this Pharaoh had a dream, that butler was able to say, when you were angry with me and put me in jail, I met a man who knows how to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh brought him out of that prison, told him the dream. Joseph was able to not only interpret the dream, but tell him what needed to be done in order to save Egypt from the famine that was about to come. Think of the consequences. They were good. He was promoted. He was able to save his family. He was able to save Egypt. He was put in the position that he needed to be in. All of this because he did that which was right. Now, if you turn to Genesis chapter 43, we read of one of his brothers. Now, Judah did not have an exemplary life. Exemplary life. Excuse me. Had an extra A in there that didn't belong. But when they had come back the first time and Simeon was left behind, and they said, we have to go back, but we got to bring Benjamin with us. Jacob said, you can't take Benjamin. His brother's already dead. If he dies, or if I lose Benjamin, I'll die. I can't live without one of the sons of my beloved wife. And if you remember at the beginning, Reuben said, let's go at once. I'll take him. I'll take care of him. And if I don't bring him back to you, you could slay two of my sons. That was a real consolation, wasn't it? So I'll lose another one of my sons, and then I'm going to kill two or three, however many of my grandsons that are your sons, just to get vengeance on you for not keeping your end of the bargain. Reuben, remember it says he was unstable as water. But then when they had to go back, Judah spake unto him, told him, we can't go back and get more food unless we bring Benjamin with us. We've already left Simeon behind. We can't go back without Benjamin. Those were the terms. So why'd you even tell him you had another brother? So how were we supposed to know he was going to ask us or want him to come as well? But then what does he say? In verse 8, and Judah said unto Israel his father, send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou and also our little ones. I will be surety for him. Of my hand thou shalt require him. If I bring him not unto thee, and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. He didn't pass it along to his sons to be killed. He said, I will bear the responsibility fully. He became a picture of Christ, bearing our sins, being our surety. And so they go down. They take the double money in their hand. They meet with Joseph. Joseph meets with them. And then once again, Joseph, on sending them away, plants the money in all their sacks again. and he puts a special cup that he had into Benjamin's sack. Now Joseph is doing this why? Not just to be mean, to test his brothers, to see what character of men they had become in all the years that he had been separated from them. So what happens? They come back after Joseph said, they stole something from me, go bring them back, and they come back. And of course, they find the cup in Benjamin's sack, and Joseph says, well, Benjamin has to stay here and be my servant forever, but the rest of you are free to go home. In verse 18, then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ear, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. Notice the respect he has for Joseph. He recognizes his position, and he gives him due honor. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have ye a father or a brother? And we said unto my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, a little one, and his brother is dead. And he alone is left of his mother, and his father loveth him. Thou saidst unto thy servants, bring him down unto me, that I may set mine eyes upon him. And we said unto my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father. For if he should leave his father would die. And thou saidst unto thy servants, except your youngest brother come down with you, ye shall see my face no more. And it came to pass, when we came up unto thy servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, go again and buy us little food. And we said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother be with us, then we will go down. For we may not see the man's face, except our youngest brother be with us. And thy servant my father said unto us, ye know that my wife bare me 2 sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I saw him not since. And if ye take this also from me, and mischief befall him, ye shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to thy servant my father, the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life. It shall come to pass, when he seeth that the lad is not with us, he will die, and thy servant shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman unto my Lord. And let the lad go up with his brethren. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me, lest peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father? And then, of course, Joseph finally reveals himself. The test was passed finally because of Judah. Not only did he choose to become surety for Benjamin to his father, but when something wrong happened, he made the choice to make good on his promise to his father. And he was willing to become the slave of Joseph so that his brother could go back to his father. He was willing to be separated from his family and his father so that his brother could go home and be with his father. That's a choice he made. You know what the consequences of that choice was? The tribe of Judah was chosen to be the kingly tribe through whom David would come, through whom the Messiah would come, whom Judah was a picture of, being surety, being the substitute. That's one of, you can read all the other stuff about Judah and all the mishaps he had and all the things that he did wrong before. But when he gets to this point, he is matured. He has become a man who knows what is right and is willing to do it no matter what the consequences may be for doing that right. All right, one more, Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. Here we have the story of Amram and Jochebed, and also Miriam. A decree went out from the king of Egypt that all the male children of Israel were to be thrown in the river to their death, because they were afraid that the children of Israel were increasing too much, and that if an enemy came and they decided to join affinity with that enemy, it would overthrow Egypt. They were afraid. They also put them under hard bondage. And during that time, Amram and Jochebed had a son by the name that they named, well, they didn't name, that was eventually named Moses. Now, they trusted God, and for 3 months they hid this baby. And, of course, you know what happened. At the end of that 3 months, they couldn't hide him anymore. So they made an ark, a big box that would float, that was covered, and they wrapped him up, and they carefully put him in that ark, and they put him in the river. And wisely, knowing that the Pharaoh had a daughter who had no children, they put him in an area of the river that she was known to bathe in. Then they left Miriam behind to watch and to see what would happen. And as Miriam watched, she saw that daughter of Pharaoh come out, that princess. She looked at what was that ark. They brought it over to her. She opened it up. And she saw the baby in there. She knew exactly what it was. It was one of the babies of the children of Israel. And that babe wept. And God smote her heart for that baby. And she rescued that baby. And she made it her own son. Named him Moses because it means drawn out. She was drawn out of the water. Then Miriam, the wise young lady that she was, ran up. Imagine this. A young Hebrew slave just runs up to a princess of Egypt and says, "Would you like me to find a nurse to take care of that child for you until he's old enough and be weaned and he can come and be your son?" And her heart was, that princess's heart was so touched that she said, "Yeah, go ahead, do that." And what she do? She went home and got her mother. And they were able to have that child with them in the house until he was old enough to go and be the daughter, or the son, of the daughter of Pharaoh. The son of the daughter of Pharaoh. She is not named, so I can't give the name there. That princess. What were the results of this act of faith in hiding, not murdering their baby, but hiding him, and then seeking a way to rescue him by putting him in that position and being prepared so that when the princess found him, to suggest to her what she could do? They saved the future deliverer of Israel, through whom God gave the law to the nation of Israel, who did all the things that he did as the deliverer of Israel, the plagues that came, finally bringing them out of the land, leading them through the Red Sea, bringing them to where they could receive, and ultimately bringing them to the brink of where they were going to be able to get into the land. And the first time, they could have gone into the land, but they made a bad decision, as you know, not to go into the land. And they had to wander until the next generation. But Moses led them right up to that point. But then he had to hand over to someone else, Joshua, the leadership before they actually went in. But all this was because they made the right choice. Well, it was all under the grace of God, right? God, the providence of God. Yes, but he still used those people and their faith to accomplish his will. See, I don't believe that God needs me to accomplish his will. But I do believe that God chooses to use you and me and all of his children to be part of the accomplishment of his will. That's a privilege that we're given, a blessing that we're given. And we should not take it lightly. And when we do what's right, we get to be part of what God's doing. And of course, if we do what's wrong, the opposite is true.